Alps, March 1945. The sky was thin and sharp, the kind of cold that froze breath to glass. 30,000 feet below, the earth was nothing but ice and silence. And above it, a single P-47 Thunderbolt hung at the edge of physics itself. Its pilot, Lieutenant Arthur Collins, had one thought left. I can't pull up. The dive had started as an escape, a clean break from two Focke-Wulf 190s cutting across his tail near Innsbruck. He had thrown the stick forward and felt gravity seize him like a fist. But then came the sound. Not wind, not engine noise, but a scream. The sky itself was screaming. The altimeter spun like a roulette wheel. 29,000, 25,000, 20,000. The controls froze. The P-47 shook so hard his teeth felt loose in his skull. The engine gauge read past redline, past logic, and then the airframe began to glow. The canopy glass shimmered blue-white at the edges, a corona of friction fire. The wings bent downward, the bolts shrieking in metal agony. Collins tried to pull, but the stick might as well have been welded in place. His eyes blurred. Blood filled the edges of his vision. The dive had gone past 550 miles per hour. The point where every manual, every engineer, every law of flight said death was guaranteed. But this wasn't any ordinary Thunderbolt. 2 weeks earlier, a mechanic named Leo Gearbox Harmon had been found under its belly with a wrench in one hand and a cigarette in the other, humming a jazz tune as he rewired the manifold regulator. He'd looked up, winked, and said, "She'll either break records or break the sky." Now the sky was breaking. At 18,000 feet, the plane should have shattered. Instead, something happened that no one understood. The nose dipped, then steadied. The shuddering lessened. The vibration smoothed out, replaced by a deep, steady hum, like a heartbeat catching rhythm again. Collins blacked out before he ever saw it. But the altimeter kept falling, the needle pegged against the edge of possibility. When he came to, he was floating through a haze of thin air and sunlight. His hands still on the stick, his plane still flying. He leveled off at 5,000 feet, heart hammering, lungs burning. The gauges were wrecked. The paint along the wings was half burned away. But the propeller still spun, steady, smooth, defiant. He turned back toward base, the air thick with disbelief. The radio crackled with voices shouting his name. When he landed, his commanding officer demanded to know what happened. Collins climbed out, still pale, and looked toward the hangar where Harmon stood wiping grease from his hands. "You better ask him," he said, "because I think he just broke the sound barrier." The ground crew swarmed the plane. The wings were warped, rivets half melted, control cables stretched like piano wire. But it was intact, and on the side the paint had blistered in streaks that looked like flame. One pilot whispered, "She went faster than jets." Harmon just smiled, eyes glinting beneath his goggles. "Guess we found out how far a man can fall before he flies." Before that dive, everyone in the U.S. Army Air Forces believed the laws of speed were set in steel and blood. There was a line pilots did not cross, a number printed in red on every instrument panel, 480 miles per hour. Beyond that, the manual said, "Control surfaces may lock. Catastrophic structural failure likely." They called it the wall of air. Engineers knew its name, compressibility. At high altitudes, the air thins, but speeds grow monstrous. Once a plane nears Mach 0.8, the air flowing over the wings and control surfaces compresses faster than it can move out of the way. Shock waves form, lift vanishes, and the tailplane becomes a brick. The nose pitches down violently, and from that moment, the pilot is a passenger. In 1943 and 44, American test flights proved the nightmare real. P-38s, Thunderbolts, and Mustangs vanished into dives, the pilots never pulling out. One report from Wright Field said it plainly. Once compressibility begins, no known method of recovery exists. That became gospel. But Leo Gearbox Harmon didn't read gospel. He read pressure curves. He was the kind of mechanic who saw limits as invitations. When other crew chiefs marked red lines on gauges, he scratched them off with a knife. "If it's in the manual," he said, "it means they already did it wrong." He'd been warning the pilots of the 367th Fighter Group for months. "Your engines aren't the problem," he'd tell them. "The air is. Make the air work for you, not against you." They laughed, of course. Mechanics weren't supposed to talk like physicists, but Harmon had an intuition that frightened even the engineers. He noticed how shock waves didn't always destroy a plane. Sometimes they stabilized it. If airflow could be bent around the fuselage the right way, the same forces that killed could save. The idea was insane, and exactly the kind of insanity the war needed. He began studying the P-47's massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine. The turbo supercharger fed air into the engine at pressure levels so high it could melt pistons. But Harmon saw beauty in the danger. If he could push manifold pressure just a few inches beyond the limit and cool the charge fast enough, he might reach a controlled overboost no one had dared attempt. His commander, Major Anders, caught him one night with the cowling off, tools scattered, cigarette glowing in his teeth. "Gearbox," he said. "Whatever you're doing, stop. That engine costs more than your life." Harmon grinned. "Then I guess I'm getting a discount." By dawn, the band mod was in place. New turbo duct routing, hand-milled intercooler valves, and a tiny methanol line feeding into the manifold. On paper, it was suicide. In practice, it was art. What Harmon built wasn't just an engine. It was a middle finger to everything safe and sacred in aeronautical design. He told the pilot who'd test it, "She'll sound angry at first. That's just her realizing she's free." When the throttle opened, the roar didn't sound mechanical. It sounded alive, too, a deep, ripping scream that made the hangar doors rattle. The ground shook. The mechanics looked at one another in silence. Someone muttered, "That ain't no P-47 anymore." They were right. Harmon had just created a machine that wanted to eat the sky. Before he became the man who broke the sound barrier by accident, Leo Harmon was just a Detroit kid who couldn't stop taking things apart. Radios, car engines, his mother's sewing machine. If it had moving parts, he had to know why it moved. Born in 1918 to a family of factory workers, he grew up under the constant rhythm of machinery. The Great Depression took the jobs but not the noise. Detroit still hummed with the echoes of engines, and Leo learned their language early. He was 15 when he got his first steady gig at a local auto shop. His boss said, "Kid, you can't fix what you don't understand." Leo answered, "Then I'll understand it until it listens." By 18, he could rebuild a carburetor blindfolded and tune a straight-eight engine by ear. Customers swore their cars ran smoother when Leo touched them, not because of what he fixed, but because he seemed to coax performance out of them. When the war came, Harmon didn't enlist to fight. He enlisted to build. In 1942, he joined the Army Air Forces and was shipped to Oklahoma for engine maintenance training. Within weeks, he was in trouble, not for mistakes, but for questions. Why are we routing air that way? What happens if we cool before compression? His instructors told him to stop thinking and start following procedures. He didn't. He graduated at the top of his class and was almost court-martialed for modifying a training plane's manifold without permission. His superior officer wrote on his record, "Brilliant, undisciplined, unteachable." They sent him to England anyway. By 1944, he was with the 367th Fighter Group, a maintenance crew working on P-47 Thunderbolts at Leaston. It was there that Harmon earned his nickname. When pilots complained that their engines didn't sound right, he'd kneel, press his ear against the cowling, and listen. After a few seconds, he'd say, "Cylinder 3's tired." And he was always right. "You talk to it or something?" one lieutenant asked. "Talk?" Harmon replied. "No, I argue with it." He kept a battered notebook filled with sketches, formulas, and profanity-laced notes about airflow and combustion timing. One page read, "Engines are like mules. They don't need orders, they need persuasion. While other mechanics waited for parts, Harmon improvised. When supplies ran low in winter, he used crushed tin cans as duct shims, filed down rifle brass for valve guides, and sealed fuel lines with wax paper from rations. Nothing about it was regulation. Everything about it worked. The pilots trusted him completely. One said, "If Gearbox signs off your bird, it'll come home or die trying." But behind the swagger, Harmon carried a deeper frustration. He saw what was coming, the age of the jet. Rumors from Germany spoke of Me-262s tearing across the skies faster than bullets. Engineers in the States called them the future. Harmon saw them as a challenge. "Jets burn air different," he'd say. "They cheat. I want a piston that fights back." When word spread of compressibility destroying aircraft in dives, he didn't see failure. He saw opportunity. "If air kills you when you hit it too fast," he said, "then find a way to make it help you." That's when he started his private project, a secret no one asked about, and no one wanted to know. Late nights in the hangar, he'd be there alone, humming swing music, tuning an R2800 until its valves clicked like a heartbeat. And one night, staring at the glowing gauges and trembling steel, he whispered, "We're going to scare the sky itself." No one else heard him. But a few weeks later, over the Alps, the sky did. In 1944, the engineers at Wright Field gathered around a blackboard filled with equations and fear. The numbers didn't lie. They just terrified everyone who understood them. Compressibility, the invisible killer above 25,000 feet. At sea level, air is gentle, thick, obedient, predictable. But as altitude rises and a plane nears 500 miles per hour, that same air becomes something else entirely. It stiffens, resists, and then begins to form shock waves that no pilot can see and no engineer can control. Every aircraft had a number, the line between flight and disintegration. For the P-38 Lightning, it was Mach 0.68. For the Mustang, 0.75. For the P-47 Thunderbolt, the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built, 0.80. Beyond that, the plane didn't just lose lift. It bent the laws of physics until they snapped. The problem wasn't just speed, it was air pressure distribution. When the airflow over the wings reached supersonic speeds while the rest of the plane was still subsonic, the resulting shockwave jammed the elevator controls, locking the tailplane like a vice. Pilots called it the dive of death. Once the nose dipped, it stayed dipped. The aircraft entered what reports described as terminal oscillation, where the forces of lift, drag, and gravity stopped fighting each other and began tearing metal apart. The statistics were cold and merciless. Between 1943 and 1944, 38 U.S. fighters disintegrated during test dives. 1 in 8 aircraft attempting dives over 550 mph never recovered. The average structural failure time above Mach 0.82, 6.4 seconds. The manual said it plainly. Beyond these speeds, the aircraft will cease to function as a controllable aerodynamic body. That should have been the end of it. But to Leo Harmon, those figures weren't limits. They were coordinates. The place where everyone else stopped looking was exactly where he wanted to begin. He studied each report, each crash diagram, each pressure map of airflow around a Thunderbolt's fuselage. What he noticed was something the official engineers had missed. The airflow separation wasn't uniform. In certain configurations, with altered cooling duct geometry and adjusted prop pitch, the pressure front moved backward just enough to restore lift at the edge of the shock zone. In simple words, if you could shift the airflow by even a few inches, you could cheat death itself. The discovery was heresy. Mechanics weren't supposed to calculate airflow equations. They were supposed to swap spark plugs. But Harmon wasn't a mechanic anymore. He was a man chasing a ghost, the sound barrier. He began experimenting with high-pressure fuel injection, not because he wanted more power, but because more power meant more control. The faster he could push the engine without overheating it, the more airflow he could generate over the wing surfaces, giving him a tool to fight compressibility, not fear it. He knew the physics. He just refused to respect the fear. One night, standing over an R-2800 engine glowing red in the dark hangar, he scrawled a line in his notebook. Air isn't the enemy. It's a door. You just need the right key. That key would soon take shape. A combination of rerouted turbo ducts, a modified prop governor, and an experimental coolant blend that would let his fighter dive faster. Climb harder and live longer than any propeller-driven machine on Earth. The problem? It was all illegal. His modifications voided the aircraft's warranty, violated Army Air Force's fuel regulations, and ignored the manifold pressure redline by almost 40%. But Leo Harmon didn't believe in red lines. He believed in listening to the whisper of metal, the groan of wind, and the sound of a machine begging to be unleashed. And soon, that whisper would become a roar heard across the mountains of Europe. It started in the quietest hours, the kind of night when the war seemed far away, when even the wind over the airfield stopped to listen. Hangar 4, Leiston Airfield, February 1945. A single lamp burned above the cowl of a P-47 Thunderbolt, its nose stripped bare like the skull of a sleeping beast. Leo Harmon leaned against the fuselage, cigarette in his teeth, a socket wrench in his hand, and a grin that said he was about to do something history wouldn't approve of. He'd been working for 16 hours straight, sleeves rolled, fingers black with oil and frost. The mechanics who stayed behind to help called it the witching hour, the time when Harmon did his thinking. Gearbox, one of them said. If command walks in right now, we're all out of a job. Good thing they don't work nights, Harmon replied. Spread across the workbench were blueprints he'd redrawn by hand, a fusion of P-47 turbocharger schematics and Mustang methanol injection designs, with notes scrawled in the margins. Reduce drag, reroute flow, heat kills speed. He was rewriting the Thunderbolt's anatomy. Step 1. Bypass the factory regulator that limited manifold pressure to 52 inches of mercury. Step 2. Reroute the intercooler duct to feed pre-compressed air directly into the carburetor, doubling intake velocity. Step 3. Inject a cooling mixture, methanol, water, and a pinch of aviation fuel, into the combustion chamber to control detonation at suicidal RPMs. When one of his crew asked if he even knew what the mix would do, Harmon answered, "Nope, that's why it's exciting." The next morning, he tested it. The pilot chosen was Lieutenant Arthur Collins, young, reckless, and just dumb enough to say yes. Harmon briefed him with the casual tone of a man handing over a grenade. Throttle smooth. Keep her under 50 inches till you clear the runway. Then give her hell. The P-47 rolled out, sunlight flashing off its bare metal wings. As it lifted, the roar was deeper, darker, than any radial engine ever built. The exhaust left a faint white trail, almost like vaporized alcohol. Harmon stood with his stopwatch, eyes fixed on the sky. Collins climbing past 20,000 feet in under 5 minutes, a feat that should have been impossible for a 10,000-pound machine. When he leveled off, his voice crackled through the radio. "Gearbox, this thing feels alive." Then came the moment Harmon waited for. "All right, drop her nose. Let's see what she's got." Collins dove. The speedometer spun past 450, 480, 510. The airframe began to tremble, and the radio filled with static. The crew on the ground held their breath. Then, silence. 10 seconds later, a sonic boom rolled over the airfield. Windows shook. Wrenches clattered off tables. Every man in the hangar ran outside, scanning the clouds for falling wreckage. Instead, they saw a silver streak flash across the horizon, low and fast. The propeller blurred into invisibility. The sound it made wasn't an engine roar, it was a scream, clean and razor-edged, like the air itself being cut open. When Collins landed, he was white as a ghost, laughing and shaking at the same time. The propeller tips were scorched black, the leading edges of the wings tinged with heat-bloomed blue. "How fast?" Harmon asked. "Fast enough to scare God," Collins said. They pulled the flight data recorder, crude analog gauges warped by vibration. But even through the damage, one number was still legible: 720 miles per hour. No one believed it. No one wanted to believe it. The official top speed of a P-47 was 433. But the altimeter read 30,000 feet, the air temperature matched the charts, and the math didn't lie. Harmon's banned engine had done the impossible. He'd turned a 10-ton thunderstorm of steel into the first piston-powered aircraft to flirt with the sound barrier. When his commander demanded to know what he'd done, Harmon only said one thing: "Sir, I didn't make her faster. I just stopped telling her to slow down." It was supposed to be a simple recon escort, a quiet mission over the Italian Alps. But March 2nd, 1945, became the day the air itself tore open. The Thunderbolt, the same one Harmon had rebuilt, was flying high cover at 32,000 feet. Pilot, Lieutenant Arthur Collins. Call sign, Devil 2. Altitude cold, air thin, radio clear. Below them, the snow-capped ridges looked peaceful. It wouldn't last. Two black dots appeared on the horizon, FW-190s, climbing hard. Collins's wingman called it out. "Bandits, high 6!" The Germans were diving, cannon flashes twinkling like sparks in the distance. Collins turned to intercept, throttled forward, and instantly felt it. The power. The modified R-2800 didn't roar. It howled. The needle jumped past the red line, manifold pressure spiking like a heart attack. The Thunderbolt leapt forward, its weight forgotten. But at that altitude, even speed had teeth. The 190s peeled off, diving straight down, trying to bait him into the wall of compressibility. Collins took it. At 20,000 feet, the world went soundless. The propeller blurred, invisible. Every instrument screamed. The stick froze in his hand. The nose went down, not like a dive, but like a fall. The kind that ends with a crater. He remembered Harmon's words from the hangar. "If she fights you, let her win. She'll find her own balance." So he stopped pulling, stopped fighting, just held on. At 18,000 feet, the tremors smoothed. The pressure around the cockpit felt like a living thing, shoving at the fuselage, molding around the wings. The altimeter needle spun out of control, past 600 mph, then 700. Collins blacked out. The world narrowed to vibration and light, the sound of a storm tearing itself apart. When he came to, the plane was level. Altitude 5,000 feet. Airspeed unreadable. He could smell ozone and burnt paint. The canopy was streaked white with ice. He was alive, and so was the plane. He throttled back, heart still pounding, and turned toward base. His voice cracked over the radio, half whisper, half disbelief. "Tell Gearbox his monster just outran death." On the ground, Harmon was waiting by the runway. Cigarette between his lips, stopwatch in hand. The plane landed hard, tires smoking, engine coughing fire from the cowl. When Collins climbed out, drenched in sweat, he handed Harmon his flight notes. Soaked, shaking, but legible. Airspeed estimate, 720 mph. Altitude, 30,000 feet. Dive angle, 63 degrees. Recovery, automatic tail lift. It made no sense. The plane should have broken apart. The wings should have sheared off. But instead, the airflow had done something miraculous. Shifted beneath the tailplane, creating a bubble of pressure that lifted the aircraft back into control. The first controlled recovery through compressibility. The other pilots gathered around the battered Thunderbolt. Its wings were warped, paint blistered, rivets half melted, and yet the propeller still ticked over like a heartbeat refusing to stop. One mechanic whispered, "She went through the sound." Harmon smirked. "No," he said, flicking his cigarette into the snow. "She danced with it." That night in his notebook, Harmon wrote a single line. Mach 0.92. "I think we just bent time." When command heard about it, they didn't believe him. When they saw the data, they classified it. And when the war ended, no one spoke his name again. But those who were there that day, who watched a piston engine break the sky, never forgot. Because for one impossible moment, a machine built for war had brushed the edge of the future. And in that scream of air, something changed forever. Within 24 hours of Collins's landing, the base was crawling with brass. The flight logs were seized. The aircraft, still warm from the dive, was roped off with yellow tape. Mechanics were ordered to step back, and Harmon was ordered to shut up. Major Anders, the squadron commander, stormed into the hangar with 2 intelligence officers from the 8th Air Force. "You're telling me this tub hit 720? He barked. Harmon shrugged, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's what the airspeed said before it melted." "Don't get smart, Sergeant. You rewired a government engine without authorization. You violated safety protocols, tampered with regulated fuel, and endangered a pilot." "Yeah," Harmon said, lighting a cigarette. "And we both lived to talk about it." The officers looked at the wrecked Thunderbolt. Its wings were rippled from stress, the paint along the leading edges turned to blue glass. The bolts had stretched, but not failed. The propeller tips were half burned, and the exhaust manifolds glowed like rusted gold. The damage report filled 22 pages, but nowhere in it did the engineers find what they expected. No signs of structural failure, no engine seizure, no catastrophic deformation. "What kind of fuel was this?" one officer demanded. Harmon blew smoke through his grin. "The fast kind." They threatened court-martial. He didn't blink. They talked about safety violations. He talked about history. The truth was, Harmon didn't care about military approval. He cared about the sound, the way the engine screamed when it was pushed past what humans thought possible. When they tore down his engine, they found his modifications. Rerouted turbocharger bypass lines. Re-angled intercooler fins, hand-filed by eye. Custom methanol water injection rig built from scrap hydraulic tubing. And on the inside of the cowling, written in pencil, "Don't throttle fear." An engineer from Wright Field arrived days later. Dr. Albert Hines, the man responsible for America's high-speed flight research program. He spent hours inspecting Harmon's work. Then he approached the crew chief, notebook in hand. "You understand you've created a mechanical configuration that violates every limit of airflow safety?" Harmon tilted his head. "Then maybe your limits were wrong." Hines didn't smile, but he didn't disagree. He asked Collins to recount the dive. The pilot's description made the room go silent. "At 600, I felt her stiffen. At 7, the shaking stopped. For a second, it was smooth, like flying through silk." That word, smooth, froze the engineers. Every recorded high-speed dive before that had ended in uncontrollable vibration, surface shock, or total loss. What Collins described wasn't death. It was stability. The physics didn't add up. The airflow patterns suggested Harmon's rerouted ducts had altered the pressure center of the entire fuselage, turning chaos into control. By accident or instinct, the mechanic had engineered the first aircraft to ride the very edge of the sound barrier, not fight it. When the tests ended, the officers called Harmon back. "You're lucky you're not in jail," one said. "But we've decided not to pursue charges." Harmon nodded. "Good. Can I get my wrench back?" They stared at him. "No, Sergeant, you're done, permanently. You're being reassigned stateside." Harmon smirked. "Figures. Can't have too many miracles in one squadron." He packed his tools in silence, left the hangar without a salute, and vanished into the gray rain. The engine was boxed, labeled "Classified, Do Not Modify," and sent to Wright Field for further study. But in the pilot barracks that night, the men raised a toast to the outlaw who had bent the air. They didn't call him a mechanic anymore. They called him the man who made thunder fly. By the summer of 1946, the war was over. But the mystery of Harmon's engine wasn't. At Wright Field, Ohio, The U.S. Air Technical Service Command quietly tore apart the remains of his P-47's power plant, documenting every bolt, wire, and burn pattern. The official reason: performance anomaly during dive test. The real reason: panic. If what Harmon had done was true, if his outlaw modification had pushed a piston engine fighter to 720 mph, then the entire structure of aerodynamic theory was about to collapse under its own arrogance. For months, engineers ran simulations, reassembled the components, and fed his configurations into early wind tunnel models. The data didn't lie. His rerouted supercharger ducting had changed the pressure recovery curve around the fuselage. It shifted the shock wave envelope just far enough aft to delay compressibility stall. It wasn't magic. It was the kind of intuition that comes from a man who listens to machines instead of worshipping manuals. The report concluded dryly. Evidence suggests the subject aircraft achieved airspeeds approaching Mach 0.91-0.92 at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet. Recovery achieved via altered aerodynamic center resulting from unapproved turbo modification. At the bottom of the file, in red pencil, one phrase appeared: destroy after review. They didn't destroy it. They buried it, deep in the archives of the Air Materiel Command. Officially, the credit for controlled recovery from compressibility went to Bell Aircraft's experimental X-1 team, whose first supersonic tests began the following year. Unofficially, Bell's engineers were handed a sealed packet of notes labeled Field Configuration Report, P-47, Leiston Airfield, March 1945. Inside, schematic fragments and airspeed data. Harmon's work, stripped of his name. The government needed a story of triumph, not defiance. Harmon's story didn't fit the post-war narrative of careful scientific progress. His victory came from chaos, from grease, gut instinct, and disobedience. Meanwhile, back in Detroit, the man himself was working at a garage off Woodward Avenue, fixing trucks. He never spoke of the Thunderbolt again. To the neighborhood kids who came by, he was just Mr. Gearbox, the old guy who could make an engine sing. But in 1948, a classified memo circulated inside the Air Force Flight Test Division. It read, "Recommend inclusion of Harmon turbo configuration in mock transition studies for supersonic prototypes." The note was unsigned. The language was careful, but the acknowledgement was clear. His work, his banned engine, had quietly influenced the designs that would take America beyond sound itself. The F-86 Sabre, the X-1, even early jet interceptors all carried echoes of the same airflow logic. Redirect pressure, control chaos, ride the shock. Harmon never knew. No one told him. His name appeared nowhere. When aviation historians later traced the lineage of compressibility breakthroughs, they stumbled across that same sealed file. Most ignored it. But one engineer from the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, reviewing the data in the 1970s, wrote a single margin note. The first true high Mach control recovery wasn't a jet. It was a field mod Thunderbolt. The file number, 47 T720. It was Harmon's aircraft. A mechanic had beaten physics with a wrench, and the world had quietly stolen his thunder. For the men who flew under Harmon's watch, the legend outlived the war. They told stories in smoky bars and VFW halls, about the crew chief who talked to machines, the man who made a Thunderbolt scream louder than a jet. To outsiders, it sounded like folklore. To those who'd seen his work, it was scripture. By 1950, the jet age had officially arrived. F-86 Sabres roared off runways in Korea, chasing MiGs across the Yalu River. The Air Force called it progress, faster, higher, cleaner. But in every hangar, among the veterans, one truth stuck. Those jets were flying on the shoulders of men like Harmon. And deep inside right field, buried beneath decades of paperwork, one weathered engine mount still bore his initials, J.H., etched into the metal with a pocket knife. The same mount that had held together through 720 miles per hour of chaos. Even years later, test pilots would occasionally bring up his name. Captain Chuck Yeager himself, the man who broke the sound barrier, Once mentioned in a 1957 interview, we all stood on someone's shoulders. I heard about a crew chief in Europe who damn near broke the sky before we even had rockets. I wish I'd met him. That's all Harmon ever got, a ghost of recognition in someone else's victory speech. By the mid-1960s, the Air Force finally declassified fragments of his test results. They were used in technical studies about high-compression piston engine dynamics under transonic flow. The academic papers cited field data, source unidentified. But pilots didn't need citations. They had proof, living proof, that courage and ingenuity mattered more than orders. Every time a fighter pilot redlined his throttle, pushing his bird just a little too far, he was echoing the same rebellion Harmon had started in that freezing hangar in 45. His philosophy had become silent doctrine. If it works, it flies. The irony? Decades later, engineers studying hypersonic flight rediscovered one of his forgotten notes, a crude sketch of airflow curling around a wing labeled smooth chaos. It described almost perfectly the principle of shockwave boundary control now used in Mach 5 aircraft. A field mechanic, with no degree, no clearance, and no budget, had mapped the future on a sheet of oil-stained paper. But Harmon never saw it. He never sought fame. He never even owned a car that could go over 50 miles per hour. He lived his last years the way he lived every flight line, quiet, patient, and loyal to the sound of engines. When he died in 1974, the local paper ran 3 lines. John Gearbox Harmon, Wabdobutu veteran and mechanic, passed peacefully. He once said, "Machines have souls if you listen long enough." His ashes were scattered over Lake Erie, carried by the wind he'd once defied. And somewhere in the archives, his name still sits on a report stamped "Banned, Unauthorized." But to those who know the story, that word doesn't mean forbidden. It means fearless. Because sometimes the future is written not by the men who follow rules, but by the ones who dare to break them. 80 years later, the sound of a radial engine still rumbles through the air at vintage air shows. Deep, metallic, alive. Crowds cheer, but they don't know what they're really hearing. They don't know that inside those roars lives the ghost of a mechanic who once pushed a prop-driven machine into the unknown. At the Chino Air Museum, a restored P-47 Thunderbolt sits under the afternoon sun. Its silver skin shines like liquid mercury. On its cowling, in tiny, almost hidden letters, someone has scratched the words, "Don't throttle fear." Most visitors walk past without noticing. But the old pilots who see it stop and smile, because they know. That phrase, scrawled by a grease-stained hand in 1945, was more than bravado. It was a declaration of faith in the human mind. That courage and intuition can outpace equations. That even when logic says impossible, the right kind of madness can make the air obey. The engineers who build the world's fastest jets today, from stealth bombers to hypersonic gliders, still wrestle with the same question Harmon faced. Where's the edge? How far can you push before the air breaks back? And somewhere in that eternal chase, Harmon's ghost still smiles, because he already crossed that line, with a wrench, a wire, and a will to prove that flight isn't about machines. It's about men who believe in them enough to risk everything. As the Thunderbolt's engine starts, the prop spins once, twice, then catches, that deep, familiar thunder filling the hangar. To the crowd, it's nostalgia. To history, it's defiance. That sound isn't just power, it's memory. It's rebellion forged in steel and flame. And every time it roars to life, it whispers across time, "You can ban a fix, you can bury a name, but you can't silence thunder."